Hello, I'm Don Daler. Our first report from 1999 is a story of corruption that has gripped the state of Illinois. It involves charges of widespread bribery and allegations that public safety was compromised for political gain. But it all began on a much more personal level, with a horribly tragic car accident and two grieving parents searching for answers.
There have been lots of good times at the Parkwood Baptist Church on the south side of Chicago, but none better than when its pastor, the Reverend Scott Willis, and his wife Janet came home with their 9th child, Pete, in September of 1994. At the age of 47, Janet had already seen 3 older children grow up, but still had 6 little ones at home. There were laughs all around that day as the youngest Willis children welcomed their new brother.
My name's Sam.
Who are you?
Ben.
And who's that? Who's the little guy?
Pete.
But this would be one of the last of the good times for the Willis family.
Okay, and then that's Hank. Okay.
A little more than a month after this home video was made, these 6 children would all be dead, killed in a tragic highway accident involving a dangerous truck and a driver with a suspect license. An accident that first devastated the Willises and now has led them on a long, difficult search for justice. What's involved are questions about a system that allegedly put thousands of unqualified truck drivers on the road and then ignored warnings of danger. Questions about state employees exchanging truck driving licenses for bribes and campaign contributions from trucking companies and truck driving schools.
Do solemnly swear.
And questions about the man whose campaign fund benefited from the alleged scheme, the governor of Illinois. George Ryan, who was Secretary of State for 8 years, oversaw truck driving licenses, but says it is ridiculous to think that his employees would do anything illegal for him.
People I don't even know. Why would they risk their home, their life, their whatever they do to go to jail so they can give me a couple $100?
Before the accident, Janet and Scott Willis would have seemed unlikely candidates to be leading the charge in uncovering political scandal. Sweethearts since the 7th grade, Janet and Scott were a devoted couple. He, a Baptist minister, she, a full-time mom who taught her children at home. On the day of the accident, theirs was a life of God and family.
It was election day in '94, and we got in the van, went up. We were having a great time.
The Willis family was headed north out of Chicago that day on Interstate 94, off to Wisconsin to celebrate one of the boys' birthdays.
I looked back, and it looked like they were all sleeping as far as I know, and then I laid back. Scott said we better get some rest.
A short distance ahead on the highway, a piece of a truck trailer was about to fall off, and other truckers were trying to warn the driver.
I knew that it was going to fall off sooner or later and someone was going to get hurt.
Yet, according to Larry Petoskey, a truck driver for 30 years, the driver didn't respond to repeated warnings over a 10-mile stretch.
Finally got up alongside of him, blew the horn at him, motioned like this to the back, you've got a problem. And he kind of looked over to me like that and just continued on his way. Tried to get a hold of him on the CB and no response.
The loose steel piece broke off about 100 feet ahead of the Willis' minivan, and Reverend Willis says he had no choice but to drive over it.
There was no way at that time I could move out of the way then. The next thing I knew that there was this sound. It wasn't real loud, but it was just a boom, a thump. And the car went sideways. And we realized later that the gas tank had exploded into the car, right to where the children in the back were. They would have had the impact of the explosion.
And immediately I heard Scott shouting, "Get out of the van, get out of the van." But as soon as I got a few feet away from the van and looked back, it was engulfed in flames, like an inferno.
Asleep and strapped into their seatbelts, 5 of the children, including 6-week-old Pete, died in a matter of moments while their father watched helplessly.
I ran to the van, began to beat on the windows, and my hands were already burned, so I began to hit with my elbows and kick with my feet. It was futile, and I knew it.
I fell on my knees, and I just started saying, "No, no," as though God would just stop it and make it all go away.
A 6th child, Benny, the oldest, got out of the van badly burned.
His hair was gone, and they were taking his clothes off because they were smoldering, and he was saying, "My feet are hot," and they couldn't get his shoes off.
He asked about the others. He said, "How are the others?" I couldn't answer, and somebody said, "They're all right."
Benny died in the hospital that night.
I must tell you that we hurt and sorrow, as you parents would for your children. The depth of pain is indescribable.
In the investigation that followed, Wisconsin police determined there was no basis to file any criminal charges. When they tracked down the truck driver, this man, Ricardo Guzman, a resident alien from Mexico, he claimed his CB radio wasn't working, and he never realized the piece was coming loose.
If this gentleman couldn't see that, he had to be blind or very unqualified driver.
In fact, several questions have now been raised about how qualified Guzman was to drive a big truck. Police in Wisconsin made special note of the fact that Guzman was not fluent in English and needed a translator, even though federal law requires truck drivers to read and speak English sufficiently to respond to official inquiries. As well, Guzman had been involved in 6 other accidents in the just 2 years since he had received his truck driver's license at a state licensing office in Illinois. It was no surprise to Terry Bruner that a driver like Guzman could get his truck driver's license in Illinois. Bruner is the executive director of the Chicago Better Government Association, a civic watchdog group, which had tracked a steady stream of non-English speaking applicants brought to state licensing offices by certain truck driving schools and trucking companies.
They couldn't speak English. They were all brought in groups. They were run right through the process.
And behind it all, according to a lawsuit Bruner's group has filed against George Ryan, were hundreds of thousands of dollars in contributions to Ryan campaigns from truck companies and truck driving schools, which Bruner says wanted to make sure their people passed, something Bruner says Ryan knew or should have known.
Mr. Ryan was running for governor, and he needed the money.
In fact, Bruner discovered some 154 Polish immigrants from New York and New Jersey had been checked into this Chicago motel by a truck driving school, and within days, all had received their commercial driving licenses, called CDLs, at a nearby Secretary of State licensing office.
Now, 154 people from a driving school, all with the same address, a Motel 6, Polish passports, and a motel receipt, or a New York driver's license. This ought to make somebody say, bang, the lights go on, what's this all about? But the Secretary of State never did anything about it. They didn't want to find it because they knew clearly what was going on with these driving schools, because they were making huge campaign contributions back to them.
And all this was public before that accident in 1994.
It was all public. No one was that interested at the time. But as soon as the accident happened, and it became clear that one of the contributing factors to that accident was the fact that the driver couldn't understand English while the other drivers were trying to speak to him to tell him that things were falling off his truck. When that happened, then of course all hell broke loose.
Particularly at what's known as the McCook licensing facility outside Chicago, where some employees soon realized that it was here the driver in the Willis accident had received his license from 2 supervisors they suspected of being corrupt.
It was a horrible feeling to think that we had witnessed something that contributed to that.
State licensing examiner Tammy Rayner says that she and a coworker had long feared just such an accident. She says her supervisors, the same ones who passed Guzman, helped non-English speaking applicants from certain trucking companies and truck driving schools get their licenses with special pre-marked tests.
These people were processed expediently.
And they always passed?
They always passed. The special applicants got the special test.
With the answers marked?
There was like an ink marked dot, and the dot would be placed next to the appropriate answer.
So not too hard to pass the test?
Impossible to fail.
But Tammy Rayner says when she had tried to blow the whistle on such corruption, she was told by an investigator in the Inspector General's office that the allegations could hurt the career of George Ryan and that she should keep quiet.
I was told that the last thing they wanted to do is have people thinking that George Ryan had a bunch of thieves and whores, I think is kind of an old term that he used, working in the Secretary of State's office.
Whether George Ryan likes it or not, a major political scandal is about to explode. When Justice Files returns. In 1994, Scott and Janet Willis saw 6 of their young children die in a fiery car wreck. Devastated, they soon found themselves struggling with the knowledge that the truck driver involved in the wreck, Ricardo Guzman, had gotten his license after a company he once worked for had allegedly paid a bribe. So the Willises hired a lawyer and began an investigation, turning their grief into action and exposing a massive political scandal in the process.
Documents and phone calls soon led the Willis' lawyer to focus on this woman, Marion Seibel, a former assistant manager at the Secretary of State's licensing office where Guzman got his license. Seibel, who has since been fired on unrelated charges, is now at the center of the truck licensing scandal. That is your signature?
This is my signature. That's my signature.
It was Marion Seibel who signed off on Guzman's license test, but she claims she has no memory of the man. And both she and her supervisor deny allegations they ever helped anyone cheat on a test.
Because there's no way. No way.
But even so, Seibel says she was routinely under pressure from what she called downtown to pass people who weren't qualified to drive a truck.
That's the way I felt about it. Because why would you call and holler at me afterwards, or when I called down there and said that the person didn't make it? And I know there was a couple of times that they went to another office and we looked up on the computer and the person passed at the other office.
Seibel says she won't be a scapegoat for anyone in all this, and that she even received a handful of phone calls directly from George Ryan's secretary.
I had gotten calls from George Ryan's secretary.
You did?
Yes.
Telling you what?
We have a person, and we want this person run through today.
Obviously, there was some wrong.
Governor Ryan, a Republican, says the focus on the licensing scandal is all the work of the Willis' family lawyer, who is active in Democratic politics. But Seibel's allegations about Ryan's office take the case far beyond just the Willis accident.
I don't know. I know who she is. No, I've never met her.
You've never met her?
Never met her. She is, I think, under investigation herself. She's been fired. We fired her some time ago. And, you know, these people make all kinds of accusations.
So she's just making that up?
I would guess that she is. I've never talked to her. Don't know her.
But Seibel produced 3 different photographs of Ryan with her. Ryan meets lots of people as a politician. But Seibel says 2 of these photos were taken at special events, honoring select state employees who had raised the most money for Ryan by selling tickets to campaign dinners and golfing events. How much money did you raise in selling these tickets?
It was $80-something thousand, like close to like 80, 82.
That you raised for George Ryan?
Right.
And Seibel says she kept copies of everything, which she showed us, going back 5 years, because she says she wanted to make sure her bosses gave her the salary increases she says she had been promised for raising money. Was it your idea to raise the money from the truck driving schools and the trucking companies?
No, I was given those names. I was given names. Check, you know, contact this one, contact that one.
And if you sold the tickets, what happened?
Well, gradually I got increases, slowly but surely, and then eventually I got the management position.
What about the campaign contributions?
What about?
They raised lots of money for you from truck driving schools, trucking companies.
And anybody that was identified there, we donated the money back. And we proved that came from those people.
When did you give it back?
$9,700 or $7,900.
Marion Seibel raised $82,000.
That's what Marion Seibel says. Now, if you can
She's got the
that,
receipts.
Well, let's see them. Let's
Telling all those tickets?
Then I'm going to tell you, if you've got that information, you ought to take it to a federal prosecutor.
Someone already has. The attorney for the Willis family, Joe Power.
Whatever I've said has turned out to be true, that fraud and corruption was rampant in Mr. Ryan's office, and let the chips fall wherever they may.
And Power has turned something else over to federal prosecutors that he obtained while investigating the case. A sworn affidavit from a member of the Secretary of State's Inspector General's office, Russell Sonnefeld, who says he was refused permission to investigate the allegations of bribery and their possible connection to the Willis accident in Wisconsin.
They told him not to look into it, don't do anything.
He called Wisconsin
to find out if it were true that this Guzman didn't speak or understand English. And he learned that that was true. Then he was going to start his own investigation as a special agent, and they called him off.
Who called him off?
The Inspector General himself, Mr. Ryan's good friend.
We always voted for George Ryan.
A longtime Republican who had regularly voted for George Ryan over the years, Reverend Scott Willis says he had a hard time believing Ryan could be involved, until what he says happened when he met Ryan at a Republican prayer breakfast.
I said, Mr. Ryan, I'm Scott Willis, and I just want you to know that Janet and I are praying for you. And at that time, you know, we didn't understand what was still out there. We just knew that there were some problems. But I didn't want him to think that, you know, this was a personal vendetta that we had against him for any reason.
What did he say to you?
Well, he jumped all over our lawyer right away.
You gave him a hard time when he came to talk to you.
I have never talked to Reverend Willis in my life. Where do you get your information?
He met you at a prayer breakfast.
Well, not that I recall.
Well, he talks about
And I want to tell you
it's
that
made
I'm
him
very sympathetic. I'm the father of many children myself. This fellow lost all of his children in a
That's
very
not what you
tragic
said
accident.
to him when he introduced himself to you.
Pardon?
That's not what he says you said to him when he introduced
Well,
himself.
I don't know what he said. Why wouldn't I be sympathetic?
Well, that's a good question.
Well,
You never met him.
That's right. It is a good question. I think anybody that knows me knows that I wouldn't have anything to do with it.
But Reverend Willis says he recalls clearly what Ryan said and how he said it.
He was in defense mode at that point. There was something to hide.
As the investigations continue, the Willises try to go on.
Somebody asked us the first year, is Christmas going to be the hardest time? And I said, no, the hardest time is going to be when Little League starts. And guys weren't out there. We're gonna hang in there. By God's grace, we're gonna stay to the end to see that justice is served.
The Willises' persistence and determination ultimately paid off. By April 2001, a federal investigation of the Illinois truck licensing scandal had produced convictions of some 25 people. Many were employees at the Illinois Secretary of State's office.
I, George H. Ryan.
As for George Ryan, he has denied any wrongdoing or any knowledge of any wrongdoing, even though authorities say that more than $170,000 of payoff money ended up in his campaign fund.
Was I involved in selling driver's licenses to people illegally? Hell no, I wasn't.
In January 2001, one of Ryan's top aides and longtime friends, the man on the right, Dean Bauer, pleaded guilty to obstructing justice, a felony. In his plea, Bauer admitted that in October of 1999, he instructed one of his secretaries to destroy 2 sensitive documents subpoenaed by federal investigators, including one document involving the Willis crash. As part of the plea deal, Bauer also acknowledged that prosecutors had the evidence to prove him guilty of scuttling several investigations of wrongdoing by employees to protect Ryan. So while Ryan has not been accused of any crime, his name continues to pervade stories about the scandal. And in early 2000, longtime Republicans Scott and Janet Willis called on Ryan to resign, a call that has thus far gone unheeded. Our next report from 2000 takes us to Chicago, a city that has been repeatedly linked to political corruption. During the 1980s, judges and aldermen were caught with their hands in the till. So in the 90s, when the FBI received a tip that aldermen were again taking bribes, the agency set up a sting operation. It proved to be one of the most successful stings of all time.
Okay, sir. What you're watching are politicians on the take. Elected officials accepting bribes, caught on hidden cameras.
12, 14, 15.
There's the man who ran Bill Clinton's '92 campaign in Indiana. taking a payoff from an undercover FBI agent in his bathrobe.
You should be right.
And the politician known as Chicago's Mr. Clean.
And I say it directly, I will not be bought.
Who pocketed $14,000 in bogus campaign contributions, using names of dead people as donors. How did they get caught? Through a vast undercover sting called Operation Silver Shovel that scooped up 18 top Chicago officials on charges of bribery, racketeering, extortion, and fraud. Former prosecutor John Gallo says the key to the investigation was an ex-con named John Christopher. In 1991, the FBI asked him how he was able to dump debris from construction sites illegally around the city.
And John answered, I was paying off the alderman.
He just offered this up. I've been bribing this alderman.
Right. They literally stumbled into what became the most successful political corruption case in Chicago's history.
Christopher was just out of prison and had no interest in going back. So the government made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Turn informant and get city officials taking bribes on camera.
Have a seat, gentlemen.
Christopher, who used the alias Johnny DeVito, was a shady figure. A chain-smoking con artist who allegedly had ties to the mafia. He was a big talker, here asking a politician to use his influence to get him a state contract.
So if you feel uncomfortable with everything I said the right way to you, okay, then there's something wrong with you. Because there's no politicians in this world that I know that don't do, give me this and I'll give you that.
John was the most trustworthy crook in Chicago. They never imagined John Christopher was cooperating with the government.
Wait a minute, when you say trustworthy crook, you mean?
There's an old expression in Chicago, don't deal with nobody that nobody sent. John Christopher was not a nobody.
He was certainly somebody to Thomas Fuller, president of the Chicago Water District. Overseeing a yearly budget of $750 million, Fuller said on an FBI tape he was happy to do business with Christopher, or Johnny D as he knew him.
Now, I can deal with a crook, you know, and he's a crook like Johnny D. And if he's crooked as he can be, but you know what? I like him, okay? But he's not, wait a minute, he's not as crooked. I like him.
Alderman or City Councilman Jesse Evans was also eager to deal. An undercover FBI agent assigned as Christopher's partner asked Evans to get city street sweepers to clean a private construction site. While taxpayers were footing the bill, the alderman pocketed over $7,000 in cash.
He's going to clean everything now. So I saved about $2,000 based on the 2 weeks. And so your share, that would be $1,000. Is that fair? Yeah. Okay. Don't want to short you. Okay, sir. Okay. Sorry.
And Alderman Evans kept getting paid for his services.
14, 15. Go out and buy a beeper.
Then there was political consultant James Blasingame, who had a different arrangement. He was paid to bring in other corrupt politicians.
Does he know what's going on with all this? Or?
Blasingame came to the apartment of the undercover FBI agent, who gave him a $5,000 payoff before he'd even gotten dressed. After almost 3.5 years of the undercover sting, the feds launched what they called Takedown Day, confronting all the politicians they caught.
The results of the interviews were coming in, and we were hearing confession in cooperation, lied about getting money. The results were stunning.
Some, like Alderman Larry Bloom, insisted they were innocent.
And I refuse to plead guilty to the false charges.
But a year later, the man known as Mr. Clean did plead guilty to accepting $14,000 in bribes.
Mr. Bloom, will you talk to us about your guilty plea?
While Bloom refused to talk, with other politicians did. We went from Chicago to the federal prison camp in Oxford, Wisconsin, where we met Thomas Fuller and Jesse Evans, both serving time for extortion. Evans admits getting city street sweepers to clean a private construction site, but says the $7,300 he received was not a bribe.
They made a campaign contribution.
Pardon me?
They made a campaign contribution to me.
Evans blamed an overly aggressive government for entrapping an honest public official.
You're saying that it's the FBI and the prosecutors who are the bad guys, not you?
You finally get the picture, Mr. Wallace. They're the bad guys.
But the most corrupt politician in Operation Silver Shovel, prosecutors say, was Thomas Fuller. When he heard about a deal a friend made, they say he set up his own meeting with Christopher, who handed him a pack of cigarettes filled with money.
What was your reaction?
Well, it was Christmas. It was Christmas time. That was my reaction.
And Christopher didn't just give him a cigarette pack. Another time, it was food, hiding a $5,000 payoff.
How did he give you the money?
He put it in a sandwich.
Pardon me?
He put it in a sandwich. You hear what I say?
I mean, I've heard lettuce and tomato.
Wait, no. What I'm saying here,
wait
you
a
can
minute,
go check.
Mr. Fuller, didn't you find, you're a smart man here.
Yeah, right.
Didn't you find it a little peculiar that John Christopher comes into your office and hands you a sandwich filled with cash?
It is strange. I admit to that.
Did you see any connection between the fact that he wanted your help and that he was handing you a sandwich filled with money?
Yeah, I saw the connection, but I'm not going to do anything. So what?
So why'd you take the money? Mr. Fuller?
Hey, wasn't thinking that day.
Of all 18 officials who have been convicted in Operation Silver Shovel, we could find only one who openly admits he was guilty.
Nobody held a gun to my head, said, take the money. I was stupid.
Alderman Ambrosio Madrana was one of Chicago's top Hispanic politicians when he agreed to help Christopher and was paid $1,000 a week.
He gave me the money, and I took it. Just like that, I took it.
I mean, you and this crook had a nice, cozy relationship.
Yes, that's what it was. I'd see him from time to time, and I'd take his money.
Well, how do you explain it?
Greed. Greed.
But in all the controversy, it's easy to overlook what may be the bottom line here. That the voters who put these men in office have been betrayed.
Are you sorry you did it, or are you just sorry that you got caught?
No, I'm sorry I did it. I am very sorry, because I understand the hurt that they're going through. I mean, it didn't just hurt me. It hurt my whole community.
Operation Silver Shovel officially concluded in January 2001, when the probe's last remaining defendant, a former town collector convicted of extortion, was spared prison because of his poor health. In the end, 6 Chicago aldermen and a dozen others were convicted. Our next report from 2000 is the tragic story of the murder of Tommy Burks, a beloved state senator from Tennessee. In an era when elections seemed to be won by the people with the best attack ads, Senator Burks was different. He served 5 terms without ever saying anything negative about an opponent. But then, just weeks before he was about to win a 6th term, Tommy Burks was murdered, killed by his opponent, a man willing to do anything to get elected.
This vehicle we're looking at is the vehicle of Senator Tommy Burks.
The murder happened on the Burks farm, along this road that leads to Tommy's daughter's house. His body was found slumped over the steering wheel of his pickup truck, shot in the head at point-blank range. A brutal, senseless crime that left the entire community wondering why anyone would harm one of Tennessee's most beloved citizens.
I always called him the people's senator because whenever anyone needed him, he was there.
I've often thought Tommy could have even been governor if he'd wanted to be.
Tony Craighead was one of the prosecutors on the case. Like almost everyone in Putnam County, he knew and liked Tommy Burks.
And the first thought you have is, who in the world would want Tommy Burks dead? Who would want this man dead? Because everybody loved him. And then you start talking to the witnesses, and they start telling you what they saw and things that happened. You start evolving. Byron Looper wanted Tommy Burks dead.
Byron Looper, the 34-year-old local politician? He was running against Tommy Burks for the Senate and losing badly. But was it really possible someone could be so greedy for political office, he'd kill to get it?
How was he different politically than your father?
Everything my daddy was, Byron Looper was the opposite.
Tommy Burks was the classic citizen legislator, a full-time farmer who still never missed a day in the State House and always made it home to his family.
Tell Pa you love him.
Byron Looper was a career politician with a record of losing. People who know him describe him as politically obsessed. He had twice lost for state office before finally winning the assessor's job in a campaign marked by Looper's vicious attacks on his opponent. And a bizarre campaign stunt. He legally changed his middle name to Low Tax, so those two words would appear on the ballot. Byron Looper was also a man drowning in problems. Not only was he hopelessly behind in his bid to oust Tommy Burks, but he'd already finished next to last in the primaries for a congressional seat. He was under indictment on 14 counts of theft and misuse of his office as county assessor. And his ex-girlfriend was suing him, claiming he'd raped her, fathered her child, and illegally transferred ownership of her house to him.
And it was almost like a case that involved the battle of evil versus good.
5 days after Tommy Burks' death, Byron Looper was arrested and charged with murder. He's been in prison ever since.
Did you kill Senator Tommy Burks?
No, I did not.
Do you know who did?
No, I don't.
If this case is a battle of good versus evil, Byron Looper believes he's the good guy, and all the problems he faces are part of a conspiracy to derail what he believes was a thriving political career. The prosecutors saw it differently and had no shortage of evidence to prove that Byron Low-Tax Looper brutally executed Senator Tommy Burks. Looper, driving a black car, was spotted the morning of the murder at the nearby Hardee's restaurant.
He just seemed like he was in a hurry and nervous, upset that he had to wait for the correct food.
Later that morning, Wesley Rex, the Burks farmhand, saw an unfamiliar black car on the farm road. A few moments later, Tommy Burks came down the same road.
Tommy asked me who was in the black car. I told him I didn't know.
Did you tell him anything else about the person?
I told him that he looked pretty strange to me because he had a pair of gloves on.
As Wesley drove off, he saw the black car turn around, then pull up next to Tommy's truck. Later that day, Wesley described the man in the black car to a police artist.
It was a Byron Looper lookalike.
Everybody was like, well, let's just take it slow and we'll walk through this one step at a time, because it would have been so easy to say, sure, he did it, he was running against him, he had the motive, we got an eyewitness, let's go put the cuffs on him.
In fact, they couldn't have slapped the cuffs on him even if they'd wanted to.
He had fallen off the face of the earth. Here he is running for an elected office in 2 weeks, and he's nowhere to be found.
But he had been in contact with people. Joe Bond, a U.S. Marine and old friend of Looper's, testified Looper came to his home.
And what were the first words out of Mr. Looper's mouth?
After I let him in the door, he said, "I did it, man, I did it." I said, "You did what?" And he said, "I killed that dude." He said, "That guy I was running against." I said, "You did what?" And he said, "I busted a cap in that dude's head."
Police also recovered a black car, an Audi that Looper had bought 2 weeks before the murder. Tires on the Audi matched tire tracks found at the crime scene. As if all this weren't enough, police even recovered the murder weapon on the side of the interstate near the Burks farm. Prosecutors traced the gun's purchase to a friend and former employee of Byron Looper. So how did Looper and his lawyers respond to all this? Well, as they say, the best defense is a strong offense. Rather than run away from their client's reputation in the community, attorneys McCracken Poston and Ron Cordova embraced it.
Been trying to find a term to describe him that doesn't offend my client, but does describe him. He is a quirky individual.
Looper's lawyers also argued that Joe Bond, the Marine who testified Looper confessed to him, was making up the story because Looper had sexually assaulted Bond's underage girlfriend.
Byron made more than just a romantic move.
In other words, the defense argued Byron Looper might have been quirky, politically obsessed, and capable of sexual assault, but that doesn't make him a murderer. The prosecution was unimpressed.
It was desperate times for him, and maybe those were desperate measures.
The defense also argued Luper's own theory, that prosecutors were out to get him because of his unrelenting attacks on the prosecutor's office and other local politicians.
But you believe that there was enough going on with you politically to frame you for murder?
There are people all over the country that are being subjected to setups. Now, if they're doing that to these, average Joe on the street, what are they going to do to Byron Luper, the most articulate, outspoken critic of the DA in that area? They're going to send me a Christmas card and eggnog? No, they're not. They're going to go after me, and that's what they did.
Coming up next, Byron Luper goes to prison when Justice Files returns. When police arrested Byron Luper for murdering his political opponent, Luper claimed he was innocent, the victim of a conspiracy. But at his trial, the jury needed just 2.5 hours to decide his fate.
We find the defendant guilty in the first degree.
Luper was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He has appealed the decision. But after 3 failed Senate races, a losing congressional bid, and a scandal-ridden 2-year stint as the local tax assessor, Byron low-tax Luper now says he's rethinking his political career.
I feel like maybe I've done more than my fair share of public service, that my shoulders are broad, and I've tried to help the oppressed and downtrodden when I could, but, I can't save them all.
Now the man who was willing to do anything, even commit murder, to get himself into the State House, will spend the rest of his life in the Big House. Meanwhile, Putnam County and the state of Tennessee are full of monuments to the good works of the man Luper killed, State Senator Tommy Burks. The first library ever built in the little town of Monterey now bears a plaque honoring Burks, who made it all happen. And the 5,000 people who turned out for his funeral were testament to how one local politician can make a real and positive difference. Still, it's little consolation to Burke's family, who continue to mourn the father and husband they loved so much.
Tom would have gladly let him have the office to have had his life.
There's a long tradition of political corruption in America, and as we've seen, it continues to flourish today. But amazingly, many scoundrels who've betrayed the public trust have gone on to win again on Election Day. Let's take a look now at the strange appeal of some of these political bad boys. When Earl Long was governor of Louisiana in 1959, his erratic behavior and heavy drinking got so out of control, his wife and friends had him committed to a mental hospital. In response, Long fired the state health commissioner, issued an executive order authorizing his immediate release, and ran for Congress under the slogan, "I am not crazy."
And I want you people to know, when looking at me, you have a friend.
And the voters believed him, sending Long to Congress. More than 30 years later, Washington, D.C. Mayor Marion Barry was captured on videotape smoking crack cocaine, set up by a former girlfriend. Barry admitted wrongdoing, went to prison, and when he got out...
This wasn't a victory for Marion Barry, it was a victory for the people of Washington.
He was re-elected mayor of the nation's capital.
I have not committed a crime.
And then there's former federal judge Alcee Hastings. Accused of seeking bribes, Hastings is but one of a handful of federal judges to be impeached by the House and removed from office by the Senate. But the public? Well, Florida voters elected Hastings to Congress to serve in the same House that had impeached him. Asked if he feels lucky.
Yes, I think luck is a part of it.
But there has to be more to it than just luck. These men had been denounced by their peers as scoundrels and rogues. and yet the voters loved them. Why?
Most of these people were very engaging scoundrels. They had a terrific sense of humor. That was part of their gestalt, part of what made them so interesting.
Clinical psychologist Renana Brooks says there is a reason why we continue to vote for those we denounce.
You're not going to vote for somebody who's a nice guy that's just like you. You want to vote for somebody who's something greater than you, beyond you, somebody who represents all the things that you can't do.
Alcee Hastings says voters respect a politician who, although down, fights back.
You don't bring perfume to a peeing match with skunks. You know you got to be ready to deal.
When public officials break the law, it can take enormous effort to bring them to justice. Do we hold politicians to a different legal standard than ordinary citizens? Here's Professor Arthur Miller.
A politician is a very difficult target for a prosecutor because the crimes they generally commit are very subtle. It's bribery or influence peddling or corruption. Now, you can watch a dollar bill move, but it's often very hard to say it's moving because of a bribe or if it's just a political contribution. And the chances are that the dollar bill is going to move through several hands before it ends up with a high-level politician. Because most things in politics are done indirectly through intermediaries and underlings. So to build one of these cases requires incredibly detailed fact-finding and record analysis. Only prosecutorial agencies with enormous resources can really go after a governor or congressman. And what's more, these cases can fall apart very easily. Jurors often don't like the techniques prosecutors use, or they don't find the indirect proof compelling, or they simply like the politician. Because you have to remember, these are often very charismatic people. That's how they got elected in the first place. They're attractive personalities, and that tends to draw juries towards them. So it takes a lot to convict a politician. Sometimes you have to go to the well many times, and as a result, it can seem that politicians are held to a different standard than ordinary citizens. But I don't think that's actually true. I think it's more the nature of these crimes, the detail and the ambiguity. And remember, as difficult as these cases are, prosecutors love to pursue them because they're very often reputation builders. If you're a prosecutor and you convict the governor, well, you're probably running for office yourself next year.
I'm Don Daler. Thanks for being with us. Join us again as we look behind the headlines at crime, punishment, and the law on the next edition of Justice Files.